Gary Player doesn't give easy answers. And at 91, he finally said what most people never could. In this video, we break down the greatest golfers ever named by Gary Player, not just by trophies, but by something deeper: control, pressure, presence, the kind of greatness you only recognize when you've lived inside the game. From Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer to Tiger Woods, Ben Hogan, and Tom Watson, this isn't a ranking. It's a perspective, a look at 5 different kinds of greatness that changed golf forever. If you think you know who the greatest golfer is, this might change your mind. Subscribe for more deep golf storytelling. What if the greatest golfer who ever lived was never just one man? For decades, people have asked that question like it has a clean answer. One name, one record, one moment that settles everything. But the longer you stay around this game, the more uncomfortable that question becomes. Because what looks simple from the outside starts to fall apart the closer you get to it. At 91, Gary Player has seen more of this game than most people ever will. Not just the wins, not just the trophies, but the pressure, the silence before a shot, the way a player changes when everything is on the line. And after a lifetime inside that world, he didn't give the answer people were expecting. He didn't name one. He named 5. 5 men who, in his eyes, defined greatness in completely different ways. And the more you look at those names, the more you start to realize something isn't right, because each of them breaks the definition people have been using for years. Some controlled the moment, some overwhelmed it, and one of them didn't just win the game, he forced it to change. So maybe the real question was never who the greatest golfer is. Maybe the real question is this: what does greatness actually look like? When you've seen everything. Let me start with a name most people think they already understand: Jack Nicklaus. Because if you've been around golf long enough, you've heard it before: the majors, the records, the numbers that seem almost untouched even now. It's easy to look at all of that and believe you already know why he was great. But that's not where his greatness actually lived. When I first saw Jack, nothing about him demanded your attention in the way people expect from someone dominant. His swing wasn't the most elegant. It didn't have the kind of beauty that made people stop and stare. If anything, there were players around him who looked more natural, more fluid, more impressive to the eye. And that's where the first mistake happened. Because Jack didn't beat you with how it looked. He beat you with when it mattered. You could play alongside him for 3 days and feel like you were right there, close enough to believe that if you stayed steady, if you avoided mistakes, you might actually have a chance. There was no panic, no overwhelming pressure early on, just a quiet sense that the door was still open. And then Sunday came, not with drama, not with emotion, nothing you could point to and say that's the moment everything changed. It was more subtle than that. Shot by shot, decision by decision, something shifted. The same player you thought you understood suddenly became unreachable. Every important shot went his way, not because of luck, because he chose that moment to be at his best. That was the difference. And it's a difference most people never see from the outside. They remember the trophies, they remember the final scores. What they don't feel is what it was like standing there, realizing that no matter how well you played, you were slowly being separated from the field. Augusta, mid-1960s. Especially those years when he didn't just win, he created distance. 17 under at a time when that number felt out of reach. And yet nothing about it looked reckless. Nothing felt rushed. It was controlled, measured, almost inevitable. That's what made him dangerous. You couldn't wait for him to make a mistake, because most of the time, it never came. And even when it did, it disappeared before you could use it. Playing against Jack forced something uncomfortable. It forced you to look at your own game without excuses. Talent wasn't enough. A good round wasn't enough. Even 3 good rounds weren't enough. Because he wasn't playing for moments. He was building pressure across 4 days. And if you couldn't survive that, you weren't really competing with him at all. That's when you start to understand something most people miss. Greatness at that level isn't about playing better than everyone else. It's about controlling when the game is decided. And for a long time, whether people admitted it or not, everyone was chasing him. But here's what makes this uncomfortable. Because as complete as that control was, there was another kind of greatness that didn't wait for the moment. It created it. Then there was a man who didn't just play the game. He changed the feeling of it. Arnold Palmer. Because with him, everything you thought you understood about control started to slip. Before he even hit a shot, you could feel it. The air wasn't the same. The galleries didn't move the same way. They leaned toward him, followed him, believed in something before it even happened. And if you weren't prepared for that, it could take you out of your own game before you realized what was happening. That was the difference. Jack made you lose slowly. Arnold made you lose without touching you. He played a different kind of golf. Aggressive, sometimes even reckless by traditional standards. Shots that didn't always make sense on paper. Decisions that looked dangerous. And yet somehow they worked often enough to create something far more powerful than consistency. Momentum. He understood it in a way most players at the time didn't. Not just how to build it, but how to use it. How to turn one good shot into pressure. How to turn pressure into belief. And how to let that belief spread through the crowd until it felt like the entire course was moving in one direction. His direction. There were moments when you could be playing solid golf, hitting fairways, giving yourself chances, doing everything right, and still feel like you were falling behind. Not on the scoreboard, but in something harder to measure, the atmosphere. Because when Arnold was in that rhythm, every birdie felt heavier, louder, like it carried more weight than yours, and that weight stayed with you even when you tried to ignore it. That's the part people don't talk about. They remember the charisma, the crowds, the way he connected with people, but they don't talk about what that felt like from the other side. Standing there trying to stay inside your own game while everything around you was pulling you out of it. If you let yourself follow that energy, you were finished. Not because you weren't good enough, but because you weren't playing your game anymore. And that was the lesson. Greatness isn't always quiet. Sometimes it's loud, unstable, emotional. And if you can't stay grounded inside that noise, it doesn't matter how well you strike the ball, you're already losing. Arnold didn't just compete against you. He made it feel like the entire environment was against you. And if you weren't ready for that, you didn't stand a chance. But here's where it shifts again, because control and emotion still belong to the same world. What came next didn't. It didn't just dominate the moment. It redefined what dominance even meant. And then came someone who didn't just step into the game. He moved it forward. Tiger Woods. By the time he appeared, golf had already seen control. It had seen emotion. It had seen players who could command a moment and players who could survive it. So when people first started talking about him in the mid-1990s, it was easy to measure him against everything that came before. That didn't last long, because from the very first shot, something felt different. There was no easing into a round, no slow build, no sense that he was finding his rhythm. He arrived already there, already locked into a level most players only reached in brief flashes. And once you saw it, you couldn't ignore it. Augusta, 1997. That was the moment everything became clear. Not just that he would win, but how he would win. Others had won before. Others had dominated stretches of tournaments. But this was something else entirely. He didn't just take control. He removed the possibility of anyone else having it. Shot after shot, there was a kind of certainty to what he was doing. Power, yes. Precision, yes. But more than that, there was an intensity that never dropped. Even when there was a moment that looked uncertain, it didn't last. He answered it immediately, almost as if hesitation didn't belong in his game. That's what separated him. Not just the ability to play great golf, but the refusal to let the moment affect him at all. And that changes everything for the people around you. Because when you're playing against someone like that, you don't just feel pressure. You feel the game speeding up, the margin for error shrinking, the sense that what used to be enough suddenly isn't anymore. That's how a standard changes. Before him, fitness was an advantage. With him, it became necessary. Before him, power was a tool. With him, it became a weapon that had to be matched. You could see it happening in real time. Younger players adjusting, training differently, preparing differently. The game itself becoming stronger, faster, more demanding. And all of it traced back to that shift. To him, and this is where it becomes uncomfortable again. Because dominance like that doesn't just raise the level. It makes everything that came before look incomplete. Control wasn't enough. Emotion wasn't enough. Even consistency wasn't enough. When you watched him closely, you realized something most people don't want to admit. He didn't just win. He forced everyone else to become something they weren't ready to be. And that's a different kind of greatness. But here's the part people miss. Because not every kind of greatness overwhelms you. Some of it is built in silence, slowly, repeatedly, without attention, and when you finally understand it, you realize how demanding it really is. There was a kind of greatness that didn't need the crowd, didn't need the moment, didn't even need to look impressive. It only needed one thing: to remove mistakes. Ben Hogan. If you only watched him from a distance, you might miss it entirely. There was no noise around him, no surge of emotion, no sense that something dramatic was about to happen. He didn't pull people in the way Arnold did. He didn't overwhelm you the way Tiger could. He narrowed the game down until there was almost nothing left. That was the unsettling part, because most players live with uncertainty. The wind changes. The lie isn't perfect. The swing feels slightly off. And in those small variables, mistakes begin to appear. One shot leads to another, and suddenly the round starts to slip. Hogan didn't accept that. He treated the game like something that could be solved. Every movement studied, every position repeated, every detail refined until it behaved the same way under pressure as it did in practice. Not occasionally, not when it felt right. Every time. That level of control didn't come from instinct. It came from something far less comfortable. Repetition that most players would never tolerate. Discipline that removed not just errors but also the freedom most golfers rely on. And that's where the truth starts to shift. Because this wasn't a natural expression of talent. It was constructed, piece by piece, year after year. You look at a place like Oakmont in the early 1950s, and you begin to understand it more clearly. A course that didn't forgive anything. A course that exposed hesitation, punished imprecision, and forced players into uncomfortable decisions. For most, it created tension. For him, it revealed control. Every shot had a purpose. Not just direction, but intention. Not just execution, but design. He wasn't reacting to the course. He was solving it, reducing it to something predictable, something that could be managed if you were willing to commit to the process fully. That's the part people admire. But it's not the part they live. Because to play that way, you give something up. You give up spontaneity. You give up emotion. You give up the idea that you can rely on feel when things start to break down. Everything becomes structure. Everything becomes discipline. And most players don't want that. They want the freedom to recover. Hogan removed the need to recover, and that is a different kind of pressure entirely. Because when your system is that precise, there's nowhere to hide, no excuse to lean on, no moment where you can say the game slipped away from you. If something goes wrong, it means something in your preparation wasn't enough. That's a hard truth to carry, and it's why very few people ever reach that kind of greatness. But here's where it becomes even more uncomfortable. Because even a system like that doesn't guarantee the final moment. When everything tightens, when the noise builds, when one shot decides everything, discipline can carry you far. But it doesn't always carry you through. And that's where the next name enters. There is a point in every tournament where the game stops being about skill. It becomes something else. Quieter, heavier, harder to explain. And that is where certain players disappear. And a few become something more. Tom Watson. He didn't arrive with the force of Tiger. He didn't carry the weight of control the way Jack did. He didn't bend the crowd like Arnold, and he didn't build the game into a system like Hogan. What he did was harder to see, until it mattered. For most of a round, nothing about him felt overwhelming. You could play alongside him and believe you understood what was happening. The rhythm felt normal. The pace felt manageable. There was no sense that you were being pulled out of your game. And that's what made it dangerous. Because everything stayed level until it didn't. There comes a stretch usually late when the air changes. Not because of the crowd, not because of the scoreboard, but because every shot suddenly carries consequence. A miss is no longer just a mistake. It becomes a shift, a decision, something that cannot be taken back. That's where most players tighten. They start thinking about outcomes, about what could go wrong, about what this moment means. And in that hesitation, even the smallest doubt begins to grow. Watson didn't go there. He stayed where he had always been, inside the shot. That's the difference people don't always notice. It doesn't look dramatic. There's no visible shift, no surge of emotion. But while others are being pulled forward into the result, he remains present in the action itself. And under that kind of pressure, that is rare. You go back to Turnberry, late 1970s. What people remember is the duel, the shots, the closeness of it. But what defined that moment wasn't just the quality of play, it was the refusal to break. Shot for shot, hole after hole. the tension building without release. And when it reached its peak, when the margin disappeared and the weight of the moment was at its heaviest, he didn't step away from it. He stepped into it. That's not technique. That's not preparation. That's something internal, and it reveals itself only when there is nowhere left to hide, because that is the truth most players eventually face. It's not enough to play well when things are comfortable. It's not enough to be consistent when the pressure is low. At some point, everything comes down to a single stretch, a few decisions, a handful of shots that define everything that came before them. And in that space, greatness changes shape again. It becomes something simpler, not control, not influence, not dominance, not discipline, but presence, the ability to remain exactly where you need to be, when everything around you is trying to pull you away from it. That's what he showed. And once you understand that, the question starts to fall apart completely. Because now you're not looking at one kind of greatness, you're looking at 5. And none of them cancel the others out, they complete them. At some point the question stops making sense, not because there isn't an answer, but because the answer was never meant to be singular. For years, people have tried to reduce greatness to something measurable: trophies, records, numbers that can be compared and debated. It feels clean that way. It feels final. Like, if you look hard enough, you'll eventually find the one name that stands above the rest. But that's not what happens when you've lived inside the game long enough. Because when you look back through the eyes of someone like Gary Player, what remains isn't one figure. It's a pattern. Jack Nicklaus showed what it meant to control the moment. To wait, to hold back, and then to arrive exactly when everything mattered. Arnold Palmer proved that greatness could live outside the player, that it could move through the crowd, reshape the atmosphere, and turn the game into something emotional, something unpredictable. Tiger Woods didn't just rise above the field, he changed the standard itself, forced the game forward whether anyone was ready for it or not. Ben Hogan revealed a quieter truth. That greatness could be built, not found, not given, but constructed through discipline that most people would never endure. And Tom Watson showed what remains when everything else is stripped away. The moment where there is no system left, no crowd to lean on, no margin for error, only presence. 5 names, 5 different answers. And none of them cancel the others out. That's the part people miss. Because the question was never really about choosing one. It was about understanding what each of them forced the game to become. And maybe that's the truth that stays with you the longest. Greatness doesn't disappear. It doesn't belong to one era, or one player, or one definition. It changes. It shifts. It takes a different shape each time someone pushes the game far enough that everyone else has to follow. And if you've seen enough of it, you stop asking who the greatest is. You start recognizing it the moment it appears. And once you see that clearly, there's no going back to the simpler answer anymore.